There is no shortage of breathtaking shots in Breaking Bad, and in my video on Breaking Bad versus Better Call Saul, I talked about how there are more shots in Breaking Bad that have really caused me to think for a while, and that isn't an indictment of Better Call Saul, that is a beautiful show as well. But for whatever reason, it's the images of Breaking Bad that I find myself thinking about more often. The Breaking Bad episode with the highest number of these mind-capturing shots per capita, I guess you could say, would be Ozymandias. It's also the best episode of television I've ever seen in general, and you can say what you will about Rian Johnson as a writer. He certainly has major issues, but his talent as a director is really hard to dispute, and what he did with Ozymandias, it was a major achievement for small screen storytelling. Now, my favorite shot, or two shots from Ozymandias, isn't one that I've seen talked about too much. As I've said, there's a lot of competition in that episode. I also love this shot of Walt and how it parallels Gus's reaction to Max being killed. But it's this image right here, of Jesse looking at the sky, that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and thinking about what it could mean given the context of not just Ozymandias and Jesse's story, but also the story of Breaking Bad as a whole. There are two interpretations of Jesse looking at the two birds in the sky that are fairly evident. One of the interpretations I actually share, but I want to expand on it a little bit. So the first interpretation, which is definitely rational, but pretty shallow in my opinion, would be that these are just two buzzards that represent Jesse's imminent death. Again, it makes total sense. Jesse is about to get shot in the head, and vultures have been a symbol of death and danger in storytelling for a long time, but it doesn't really fit the tone of the moment for me. And on a side note, I really like the animation here of the vultures circling down to the bottom of the cliff. I'm not sure why, it's very pleasing for some reason. Getting back on topic, by this point in Breaking Bad, Jesse had been established as an extremely flawed person, a person who had done some terrible things, but someone who deserves better than getting wasted in the desert and thrown into a ditch. So even if his death were to occur in this scene, I don't think they'd make the last thing he sees on Earth the vultures that would pick him apart if Jack just left him in the desert. So it's the second interpretation which I'm going to expand on, and the interpretation is that the birds represent Jesse and Jane. And I like that idea, it makes a lot of sense. For one, it isn't a swarm of birds in the sky, it's only two, and they seem to be in complete sync with each other. Birds also tend to symbolize freedom, and for me that's a better symbol for this situation than death, because Jesse had been enslaved to people, to drugs, to guilt, so his death would free him from all of that. And if he believed in something after death, there's no doubt that the first person he'd like to meet is Jane. So all in all, I think that the birds do represent Jesse and Jane and their possible reunion in the next life, and it's from there that I want to make a broader point about how this interpretation could connect to the story as a whole, or at least in my mind. So what happened in the desert before Jesse is captured? And I'm sure all of you know this, but it's worth restating for the sake of the video. Hank Gomez and Jesse had just tricked Walter into driving out to the desert because he thought they were burning his money. In an act of desperation, Walter calls Jack, and then Jack and his men kill Hank and Gomez. And then Jack sends his men out into the desert to find Walter's buried money. At the heart of all the tragedy we see in Ozymandias is human greed and pride, the valuing of material things over life itself. And this is perfectly symbolized when Jack's men dump Hank and Gomez into the same ditch that Walter used to store his money. 5 episodes earlier, in the aftermath of Todd murdering Drew Sharp, Jesse decides to throw all of his money away. Walter and Todd were able to move past that event with their greed still intact. But Jesse was not able to. For what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? That's the piece of wisdom that Jesse was able to feel. Todd describes it as the most profitable train heist in history. But for Jesse, the cost could never be recouped. Jack and his men are looking inside the earth for more money. But when Jesse has a gun to his head, he looks to the sky at something different. He's looking at something that cannot be counted, something that can't be stored in a bank, or used to buy a mansion. He's looking at the representation of his love for Jane, which meant so much more to him than the money that he made with Walt. When Jesse looks to the sky, I think there is a message being sent about 2 different ways humans can live their lives. You can be like Jack and his men who look down into the material world and pursue the wealth they think will make them happy, or you can look up at the things that are eternal and more meaningful, the things that won't be washed away by time. Of course, this message hinges on whether you believe in something more than the material world, but nonetheless, it's quite the message. If you enjoyed this short little video, I have a couple other videos on Breaking Bad symbols, and one that focuses on the role of God in Breaking Bad, which I think is relevant to this topic, so check that out. And subscribe for more story-related videos in the future. Have a fantastic rest of your day. I will talk to you soon.